Go ahead.
Okay, I am Aviva Romani, an ecological artist, and we're here with Carol Padberg and Karen Quomey, and if we're lucky, we will shortly have Jim White, the Dean at the College of Art and Science at Boulder, Colorado, join us. The title of this conversation is Interdisciplinarity and New Paradigms. And I'm going to just quickly give the credentials of my colleagues here. Carol is the program director for NOMAD 9, an interdisciplinary MFA program at the Hartford Art School at the University of Hartford. And Karen is the, I'm just going to read from your bio last night, is a curator, writer, and arts administrator, and the director, chief curator of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics at the New School, where she also teaches. And last night she did, I think it was the last in that series, wasn't it, Karen?
No, we're midway through. There are two more, and then the closing event. It went on really long. You look a little horrified.
No, they've been wonderful. This is a series of panels on freedom of speech as a curriculum for studies into darkness. And the one last night was on language. And what was interesting to me about the panel, and what I think is, oh, there's Jim. What was interesting to me about last night's panel and relevant to this topic, hi Jim. I'm going to interrupt what I was saying to introduce you. Jim started the Instar Stable Isotope Lab in 1989, and his research has helped to show that large climate changes tend to occur in the natural system as abrupt and rapid shifts. And so he's famous, and he's also the Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of Colorado. I was just introducing Carol and Karen, and I'm just very quickly going to say that they are both educators. Carol has started a program at the University of Hartford in interdisciplinarity, and Karen is the director at the Vera List Center for Art and Politics at the New School. And I had just started to say that Karen did one in a series of events last night. And this was about language and communication and translation. And what is relevant to this conversation today is that the speakers, who are all wonderful, address the question of whether or this is how I interpreted Karen, so you can correct me, address the question of whether we can even think in terms of answers and solutions anymore, or whether we have to somehow live in what I would call radical uncertainty going forward. And education has been the primary template for culture to think through huge shifts, which I think we're in. So what I hope we will talk about is 2 or 3 distinct ideas that are related. One is, in fact, do we have to abandon the idea of any kind of paradigmatic template? And if so, where do we go from there? I would say that education and academia is very much being questioned and somewhat under assault these days. And I'm not even sure it's the ecosystem where we might answer these questions. But one thing that I have been very sure of my entire life is that if there are any answers, if there are any solutions, if there are any paths forward, they're going to come out of interdisciplinary thinking. So if any of the three of you would like to launch into that conversation, I would love it.
Maybe I can just start, and really, because I could offer a slight follow-up to what you said in your very significant introduction, Aviva. The talk was very much about how do we find a solution, or how do we carve out a political position, and because the focus was on language and translation and communication, the consensus was among panelists who came from very different fields, very far afar from each other, that true understanding in a different language, or of a different language, or even of a different position is no longer possible, and it is or was never possible, and that the intention to acknowledge someone else and the intention to accept that there is another being there that we do not understand in itself can be considered a political act, and opens the possibility of affect, of alliances that no longer are based on factual information or shared explicit position, but an acknowledgement of our communality being together in at a certain time.
That's a mouthful.
So basically you can, but I mean, it was, you can't translate anything. Everything is results in mistranslations, miscommunication, misappropriations, and that it's better to acknowledge that the way we organize ourselves is actually based not on information only. And this was partially informed by a performative lecture and then a poem at the end read, each one read by an indigenous practitioner. Anyway.
Well, I'll jump in there.
Please, go ahead.
Because I think that there's so much in what you just said that I appreciate. I think as someone who cares a great deal about educating artists in a way that is true to the times we're living in, we have to start with the question of what can we access and what methodologies are most fruitful at this time of mass extinctions, of perhaps reaching limits of what we can intellectually say is capital T true, not to question the sciences, but rather this notion of transdisciplinary knowledge. And so what I've been involved with in the Nomad 9 MFA, which I founded 4 years ago now, is using a pathway of field-based knowledge acquisition through experience, through materiality, through indigeneity, and through the multiple lenses of various disciplines, whether that's post-humanism or science or the social humanities and how we understand community and ways to organize ourselves. But the significant process that has been working well in this very young program is that we have students who arrive from all over the world at a site for 2 weeks of study, and that we're learning from people from that place who are approaching it through a deep knowledge of the ecology, of the social histories of that place. And by having these experimental pedagogical experiences, which could range from learning backstrap weaving to walking through the swamps of South Florida together with Mark Dian, talking about histories of knowledge, By doing this, the students seem to be able to take away an approach to learning that is place-based and that is grounded in the materiality of the human body, as well as the matter around us. And that gives me a lot of hope. So, well, I think there's a strand of frustration and just the deep weight of the distance we have to bridge between disciplines and you know the limitations in some regards of what we can do with our minds and our minds alone. I find that to be balanced by experiential knowledge, especially bringing in deeper human knowledge systems that are represented by indigeneity.
So before we go to Jim, who always has something interesting to say, and usually quite optimistic, I would like to go a little bit deeper into what has emerged as something of a dichotomy in academic discourse, which is the distinction between considering these questions as human-based in terms of class, race, gender, and so on, as opposed to considering these issues in an environmental matrix of other species, and of course climate change and other aspects of the Anthropocene. So either Carol or Karen, would you like to comment on that before we go to Jim?
Do you want to go first, Carol?
It's an interesting question. I think clearly it's when we're talking about other species knowing, how they know, what they know, other species' ways of being, we're limited by our human vantage point. So there are many ways you can consider a division between humans and other forms of life, but I'm less interested in that than I am in understanding more about the connections, more about the limitations of how humans know, and more about how we will need to bridge to understand and make spaces for other species, or understand and make less space for our own species.
So let me go to Karen and pick up on this word bridges, because the implication to me is that if we can build the right bridges, then we can understand the other. But the takeaway from last night is no, we may have to abandon that hope.
I think certainly the notion of bridges, or even the notion of passages from one realm to another, was questioned by this anthropologist, Stefania Pandolfo, for instance. But I think responding also to Carol's question of, can we know another species? I think we certainly cannot, or I wouldn't claim to do that, but we can know our own ways of navigating this world better. And I think we have to explore those more carefully. And in this case, I'm thinking of this political scientist, Jane Bennett at Johns Hopkins, who's written this amazing book called Vibrant Matter. And she begins the book, I read it a while ago, but I think very soon, very early in the beginning, there's a description of how she walks through downtown Baltimore, and she stumbles over a pile of garbage, and the garbage affects her entire day in profound ways, because she lets it do so, and she pays attention to it, and then it goes into the agency of the cigarette butts and whatever is in this heap of garbage. So I think observing from a far distance what some indigenous positions might entail is really just paying closer attention and acknowledging that as I sit at this desk with fake wood under my keyboard, that affects me and shapes me and determines to some extent my relationship with everything around me.
So now, Jim, I have a couple questions for you. I imagine you saw the news flash this morning about the solar storms and how quickly they reach the Earth and how we know about them from ice core sampling. And what was interesting—
No, I didn't see that.
I
Oh, you
didn't.
didn't?
No.
Oh, well, there's evidence of this huge storm in the ice cores under Greenland, and the storm was solar, and it took about 45 minutes to reach the Earth, and it was way beyond what anybody is prepared to deal with. So if it happened once, it can happen again. So the takeaway from that is that we can prepare all these really beautiful models of how we're going to address our problems, and then we have something from left field, like a solar storm or a Trump for that matter. And so my question for you is, where do you see the patterns in interdisciplinarity in your own work as an educator that address the scale of uncertainty, unpredictability, and sheer challenge for our times?
Well, there's a lot to comment on in there. So the sort of two broad areas of inquiry when we're dealing with the environment. One is the physical environment, and we take comfort in the physical and chemical laws that we can observe here, knowing that those physical and chemical laws are, no one has yet figured out how to beat gravity. I'll put it like that. Now, having said that, since humans are the major agent of change on the planet today, we have to also understand human beings, and that's where it gets a lot, not only does it get harder, but this whole issue of, is the observer unbiased in their observations becomes really important, because we carry with us our cultural baggage, even as scientists, when we look at the data we're looking at, say in an ice core or anywhere else. And whether we are willing to admit that or not, or probably even more importantly, whether or not we know that is really a question. We approach our understanding of the climate system with a very Eurocentric, background for the most part, which brings with it a whole bunch of unintended biases that we don't fully understand, and really probably aren't obvious, and aren't going to be obvious, even if somebody points it out. Well, most of us will go, "Oh, I didn't do that," or "No, I'm not that way." But we know it's real. I mean, we know that does indeed cloud what we do, even as physical scientists. And then when you get into the more sociological, the more social science, the more ethical issues, it just gets deeper and deeper really quickly, and becomes more and more important for us to understand where our vantage point is before we make pronouncements about, all right, this is the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do, or whatever. So that told you nothing, but
no, it helped situate some of the conversation. What my takeaway was the term Eurocentric. And the reason that jumped out at me is because in some research I was doing yesterday, I happened to come across a couple of papers on corollary thinking, specifically from China and India, and my interest relates to our experience of time. But it was very interesting to consider that in China, which is rising, as we all know, and India, it is okay to think about corollary thinking. And of course, a lot of art is about corollary thinking, which is not evidential, obviously. So I'm going to go back to you, Jim, and ask you to comment a little bit further about the role of corollary thinking in Eurocentric biases.
Well, I don't know that I can really speak well to that. I can agree with you that there's very well understood differences in how Chinese, Asians approach problems and how Europeans and North Americans approach problems. We tend to be much more reductionist. They tend to be much more inclusive of all things all at the same time. And personally, I find it really interesting and I don't know quite what the word is, but to have a bunch of different approaches attack the same problem is a good thing, because we can all turn to each other and go, oh, you missed that, or did you think about this as deeply as you should? I think the key is obviously that we don't get so wrapped up in how we approach things that we dismiss how other people approach things. That's where hubris gets in the way, and where we can really trip over our own 2 feet.
You mentioned the word reductivism, which I would correlate with Eurocentrism. And that was striking to me because, again, another theme that came up last night was linear thinking and the relationship between linear thinking and colonial behavior. And so I'm going to go back to Jim again, and then we're going to come back to Carol. Jim, as a scientist, my limited experience of science is that linearity is the whole gestalt. It's the whole hamburger. It's the whole thing. So if it isn't, from a scientist's point of view, how do you consider data?
Well, I would disagree. I don't think linearity is the whole thing. Linearity is certainly a method of thinking. It's a method of approaching problems. And it's actually a pretty good method when you don't know much about something. Start simple and sort of peel away, one thread at a time. But we understand that, when problems start to get complex, you also have to think in a complex way. And I think that's, as an environmental scientist, I was trained pretty early to approach things in a complex way, because none of the problems we're working on are simple. And they're all pretty knotted up. And so it was, you can argue that we take a linear approach to peel pieces apart, but there's only so far you can go in a linear approach, because that might take you down an alleyway that is not a very fruitful alleyway. You have to, as you are peeling back the curtain and understanding more and more about what you're seeing, you need to look off to the sides, you need to look up, you need to look down, you need to look behind you and figure out, okay, where am I going with this solution? And what possible other solutions are being ignored if I just focus in on this one?
Yeah, I'll jump in there.
Please, I was just about to invite you to do that.
I think that so many of the issues we're facing right now are what is now commonly known as wicked problems. They're not going to be solved by any one discipline or any one approach. They're systemic in nature. They feature all of these interdependencies of interlocked problems, in fact. And so I really appreciate what Jim is saying about systems where, yes, you need individuals who can think with complexity and depth within a discipline, but then you also need to account for the blind spots of that process. And I think the arts are a really great base of that kind of complementary set of processes where in truly interdisciplinary work or then transdisciplinary work, you have people working together to create something that no single discipline could have come up with. So it's easy to say that. It's I think somewhat more difficult to make it happen. You know, often there's a lot of serendipity in terms of getting the right team together at the right time and with the right circumstances and funding and so forth. But to me, there's a sense of purpose in trying to educate artists to have that capability.
I think that's really important. We see more and more successful solutions coming from teams of people, where you have a bunch of different expertises represented. To me, the really interesting folks on those teams are what I call the glue makers. You know, the folks who can, the glue makers, folks who can see all sorts of different sides and figure out, oh, this is where we need. This is how we put these people together in order to. This is how we glue a whole bunch of humans together to form something that is a much bigger problem solver. Those people really I find fascinating because they're few and far between, and they're able to think, you know, not only in one discipline, they're able to think in other disciplines. They're able to, you know, by whatever means, their brain is able to absorb things from a bunch of different ways.
Have you seen any patterns in the sort of backgrounds those people come from, or the traits of their ways of handling data or questioning?
Yeah. That's a great question. Just in the sense that they seem to be intrinsically interdisciplinary. They're you know, for example, they're not the best physical scientists. They're not the best chemists. They're not the best physicists. They're not going to be the Nobel Prize winners. But they're going to be the difference makers because they know how to get that Nobel Prize winner to talk to an artist or to talk to someone else in order to think about other problems. I don't know. I mean, I think it's, you know, as the dean of a College of Arts and Sciences, I think they're the often ignored large groups of people who are much more, you know, they're trained in getting out of their comfort zone. They know how to do that, which is what we do in a liberal arts education. They already know, you know, we've already shown them that they can be successful, or they've shown themselves they can be successful, getting out of their comfort zone. And some people just sort of naturally gravitate towards, you know, I want to learn more about this other thing over here that I didn't know anything about. Tell me more about this. And that's, I find those people really fascinating.
So I want to dig a little bit deeper into the pragmatic issues in transdisciplinary learning. And Carol, I know that you have struggled a bit with bringing hard scientists on board. And something we've also talked about is it's easier to get research money for the hard sciences. It is not easy to get money for what Jim is calling the glue people. That wasn't the term you used, but
what people?
Glue is less.
Glue people. Yeah, that's a really, really bad term. But you know, that's what you got to just say what pops into your head sometimes, and that's what popped into my head. So.
Okay, so I want to address this on the practical level because it's one thing to talk about, yeah, interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. We know we need it. It's often really hard to get the support to make that happen. And I know that you've struggled with that, Carol. So would you like to comment a bit further on going from the theoretical to the practical?
Yeah, I think what you're recalling is that we were talking a few weeks ago about how this is a low residency program. And so we're not the sort of academic setting within this program where students would have access to scientists in the lab or other specialists that need the university facilities to do their research. Instead, what we do is we students who have teams sometimes already set up where they live, and we mentor them on what some of the next steps might be. So yeah, there's a challenge in terms of the low residency program not being right for everybody. But that being said, we have some really interesting examples of interdisciplinary works with, I think, what would really be transdisciplinary results. But they're not based in the university, which I think is really interesting and is a part of regenerative culture, is that you're able to find the right team where you live outside of an institution. So I don't know if that sheds light on what you were hoping to get at.
Well, what I'm getting at is money. When you go through assembling a team and you do it in unconventional ways, then there's a big challenge with getting support for those people. Mm-hmm. And that slows down the possible progress.
I feel like that's a universal for artists, that we are always trying to find where the money is and how to phrase the need and purpose of what we do in a way that matches with funds that often are not directly to support the arts, but are supporting arts as part of something larger, whether that's humanities funding or funding from the sciences. So yeah, that's a big challenge and something I feel a great responsibility to train artists on.
So I'd like to open it in case you guys want to ask each other questions, because I'm always the one asking questions. So I think I should shut up a little bit and let you guys provoke each other.
Maybe I just have a little follow-up to the previous question about funding and how to, tell the story. The challenge is indeed, if an artist works interdisciplinary or a program is interdisciplinary, to identify the metrics by which that actually has impact and to whom. And I think increasingly, we're being told we should tell stories, and for the stories you need an individual, and the individual by the mechanism through which a story works, cancels out other protagonists in the story. So I find it quite challenging, not so much to deliver the story, but to be ethical in bringing everyone to represent the story that would elicit the funding, when in fact certain spokespeople or certain individuals in that transdisciplinary investigation are more gifted and simply more effective in summarizing or conveying a story. And maybe going back to the first discussion point we had, that it's not only about the actual metrics or the actual factual information, but it's also how something is said, not just what is said or how a story is told.
That's a really interesting point. And I wish somebody would go a little bit further with what I hear as the contrast to some extent between metrics and narratives and corollary thinking. If anybody wants to tackle that one.
I'm curious what you would say about that, Aviva.
Thank you. Well, it's a really interesting question to me because when I did my dissertation, my first supervisor was an environmental scientist, very grounded in metrics and hard science. And I simultaneously was working on a certificate in geographic information system science, which is all statistically based to find conclusions and analyses, which were quite linear. And yet, I was completely immersed in corollary thinking. For example, the metaphor of the lost drift nets, ghost nets, and many other metaphors that have really moved me. So I find it easy to move between those fields, but then when I try to communicate or even argue from that point of view, I know I've lost people right from the get-go because it's too many different parts, or it often feels like I am thinking in too many different parts for people to find that linear thread that gives them a narrative, a simple narrative. And the problem, I suspect, is, and I love quoting this humorist who said, for every complex problem, there's a simple solution, and it's the wrong one. That there just isn't a simple narrative to this. And it brings me back to what I was thinking about, particularly with what Aruna D'Souza said last night about the limits of our understanding and the necessity to live with what may be extreme discomfort. And not just our discomfort, but the discomfort of so many people around the globe right now, not to mention other species that are going extinct. To me, it's a really staggering problem of how to encompass all of that. So I don't know whether that answered your question. I don't think it did, but it was a ramble on topic.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't see simple answers to this.
I would like to take up this notion of comfort or discomfort, and I guess comfort, and ask Jim about what you said about the comfort that solid science provides in, I guess, describing factual conditions or physical conditions. That seems a wonderful place to start at.
Well,
is that actually the case? Can one say that certain core laws or principles like gravity we know all about it and we can move beyond it or build on it?
Yeah, that depends on how you want to define knowing all about it.
Yes.
So, we're always digging a little bit deeper into even the most fundamental laws. But if you are willing to take a step back and take a macro view, yes, we understand gravity. We understand that it's unchanging. We understand how it works. We can design airplanes that, unfortunately, they don't always stay in the air, but but we can fly. There's a whole bunch of things we can do because we understand gravity. We understand fluid dynamics. So the physical principles by which things operate. One could argue that the mathematical tools we use to describe these are not perfect, and we are probably too linear in our approach in the mathematical tools, even calculus, which is anyway. But I think when we study the physical nature of the planet, we do indeed take comfort in some of the basic principles. In my own field, I study climate systems, and knowing that a carbon and two oxygens organized OCO, the vibrational frequencies of those bonds are in the infrared is really important, because that's the energy that the Earth is trying to expel to outer space. And so a molecule like that is going to act as act to slow down the energy released to outer space and warm the planet up. And the fact that that molecule will always vibrate at that frequency, it cannot vibrate at another frequency. I mean, you can energize it and make it do some different things, but it's not going to suddenly become something that absorbs in the ultraviolet or, you know, in some very different part of the spectrum. We know what it does, and because of the mass of those molecules and the way that the molecules are put together, we know that, you know, that's what's going to do. And there's comfort there. I mean, you know, we knew 100 years ago that if you add more water vapor, CO2, methane to the atmosphere, that you'll change climate. And people wrote papers about that. It's why, you know, 100 years later, it's pretty remarkable that we still have people who argue about that. So there is some, you can take some comfort in those things. And interestingly, it's not, if you think about it, did it have to be that way? You know, so this is where it gets, in my opinion, even more interesting. You know, why is gravity constant? Why do molecules always vibrate the same frequency? Why could they not, you know? In other words, you know, to put it kind of in a different way, why isn't that alchemy didn't work? Why is it we can't take lead and turn it into gold? You know, what are the physical, why is that the case? One could imagine living in a world in which gravity varies every day. You know, some days you wake up on the ceiling and some days you wake up on the bed, and you just have to learn how to deal with it. But that's not our world.
And the nature of the comfort comes from the fact that it is something we all share, that we
right. No, it
almost ignore, and we can turn to more urgent or more, you know, pressing problems.
Right. You know what is going to, we know that climate is changing. We know it will continue to change. There are some very simple physical laws that are being applied here. And it's not you know, there's really no sense in arguing about that. Now, the fact that we argue about it is fascinating, you know, that we feel the need to argue about it. But here's, you know, I know that regardless of how much somebody might argue about it, I know they're wrong.
Mm-hmm. So Jim, I'm sorry to, and I don't mean to monopolize this conversation, but so how do you explain that some people argue about these facts that seem, you know, absolute given? And I'm not talking, I mean, I'm talking about scientists who might, you know, subscribe to Trump's policies. And how can that be explained, that these facts can be supposedly can be interpreted one way or the other? Or is it not really about the facts? Is the conversation pretending to be a scientific one about climate change, but it actually serves a completely different purpose?
No, the conversations clearly serve a different purpose. Whether or not they're pretending, I don't know, because that therein lies intent, and I can't really think through the full nature of intent there because I don't have the facts there. It is, you know, we are quite capable of holding two very, very different beliefs, you know, in our heads, contradictory beliefs, and just plowing right on. I mean, we humans, I think, are by our very nature complex thinkers. You know, we tend to try to explain things in linear ways, but in reality, we're quite complex. And I don't know, you know, I don't think that there's any really reputable scientists who understand physics and chemistry who would argue that we're not changing climate, because it's just really, you know, that's really, really hard to do. So when you hear, you know, those people, you know, say that, you know, we don't have consensus or blah, 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 this is, you know, political bullshit, and they're just spinning their tail. But then they're acting in a very different way. They're now injecting a different kind of analysis, a different kind of thought process into the whole conversation. This is no longer, it's no longer a conversation about chemistry and physics. It's a conversation about belief. It's a conversation about persuasion. It's a conversation about, I would like to make as much money as I possibly can, regardless of how much damage I'm doing to the environment, but I'm going to get all the money I can. Thank you. And I'll move on. It's those kind of conversations.
So I'm curious about the idea that there are certitudes in Western science. I'm not sure in Eastern traditions whether they would be equally assertive about certitudes. I'm just curious about the idea that if, for example, gravity is a certitude, is it also possibly a paradigm? Would that make it a potential source of corollary thinking? I'm very taken with corollary thinking because it is, to me, what art is about. So if that was a comprehensible question, I'd be curious what anybody has to say about migrating from the hard sciences and those certitudes to models that might address some of these thornier human problems.
Well, it is, it is an interesting question. Just how much faith do we put into scientific certainties? I can tell you this, I would never, climb up onto a high bridge and step off. And I would never recommend anybody do that. Thinking that perhaps this would be the first time that gravity didn't work, in that particular area. I wouldn't recommend it, and I wouldn't do it. Would I be open to somebody stepping off a bridge and floating in midair? Hell yeah. I would find that fascinating. I would go, wow, it happened, I'd be very surprised. I'd be, as a scientist, I'd be just fascinated by that. But I sure as hell wouldn't test it myself. And I wouldn't stand there, with a big box of rocks and just keep dropping them off and hoping one of them didn't fall. I would find that to be a waste of time.
So we just have a few minutes, and I wonder whether, and I know, Jim, you always try to scamper out a little bit early. You come late.
Well, I do.
And you leave early. It's really deplorable.
I know. Well, I am a deplorable. That's it.
So I wonder whether anybody would like to make some comments about this conversation, and specifically the idea that if we can approach some of our present challenges in an interdisciplinary way, we might have a better chance of surviving the Anthropocene.
I'll step into a corner of that. That's a pretty grand statement. And I think that one of the things that's clear to me is how, like Buckminster Fuller said, when we're creating a change in a paradigm, we shouldn't look back to what the old one was and try to change it. We really need to put our attention on creating something that makes the old system obsolete, right? So I think in order to do that, we need to foster the poetic thinking of artists in conjunction with the different ways of knowing or methodologies of various disciplines, and that it's where those paths cross that we're most likely to gain traction and come up with breakthroughs, whether they are very practical in nature, the sort of thing that Jim was talking about earlier, where cross-disciplinary approaches catalyze scientists to have an awareness they might not otherwise have, or whether it's a sort of change that allows humans to make different decisions because they're coming to it from a consciousness that perhaps is less governed by capitalism and more governed by a sense of solidarity with life forms on the planet or the planet itself. So I would put my energy and belief in that kind of ability for the poetic and the rational to trigger something that neither can do alone.
Well, this has come up on a bunch of panels, like whether we should just toss out the whole old thing. But Thomas Kuhn argues that we can't do that. There has to be this bridge in logic between the old systems and the new system. And Jim, you were going to say something before I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to, you know, I agree 100% with what you were saying, and that I find it rather odd that, I mean, I would decry the fact that we have 7.5 billion people on the planet, because I think that's too many. But at the same time, we have 7.5, I mean, that's like having a hugely powerful computer, and we're using so little of it, right? We're using maybe 1 million of the mostly, you know, Caucasian male brains to make this thing function. And it's ridiculous, right? It doesn't make any sense at all when you've got that kind of massive power, mental power available, and we don't use it. Sorry, of the rant.
Karen, would you like to have some last words on this conversation?
Well, I'm not sure I can match that. That was very exciting to think of this enormous computer power. I would maybe go back and embrace actually the way history is inscribed in everything we do, and I think it's very important for us to be aware of it. So different from Buckminster Fuller, I think we need to uncover and dissect and be aware of how we got to where we are. I think that also allows us to be more sensitive and more alert and pay better attention to what's going on around us. And I think that is the transdisciplinary, or the beginning of a transdisciplinary approach or sensibility to, you know, look at your own situation and see what, or begin to understand what shaped it.
I'm going to have to sign off, but thank you so much. It was a very stimulating conversation.
Bye, Jim. Carol, you looked like you were going to say something before we sign off.
No, I think those are wonderful last words. I think it's going to take reflection on how we got here, as well as a kind of rupture into something new. And I don't think those are binary opposites.
I agree. Thank you, guys. It's been a real honor to have this conversation with you all.
Thanks for bringing us together.
Yes, nice to meet you all.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Take care.